Forgotten first attempts in history by Serious History. Alright, throughout history, so many bloods have been doing so many cool things, and then the first time they did it, everybody forgets, So we have to remember them in this video. Let's see.
We tend to take a lot of aspects of modern life for granted, but humans weren't always flying around the world or performing life-saving operations. There was always a first time for everything, and a lot of this stuff had to be figured out the hard way. So today, we're taking a look at some forgotten first.
Like, who was the first guy to know to eat chicken? Then the first guy had to eat chicken raw to know that it was bad to eat chicken raw. You get what I mean? So he must have been going through it, honestly. And whoever that guy is, thank you.
First attempts in history. Some were successful, some, not so much. Number 5, the first international flight. Did you know that the first international flight was done by 2 nearly naked men? The invention of the hydrogen gas balloon in 1783 sparked a mania to discover the limits of human air travel. New records were being set weekly, and the pursuit of going down in history as the first man to do something was on everyone's mind. On a cold morning on January 7, 1785, 2 men, French inventor and balloonist Jean-Pierre Blanchard and American doctor John Jeffries, set out to make history by doing something no man had ever done before. They're going to attempt to fly a gas-powered balloon across the English Channel from Dover, England to Guines, France. The flight would be approximately 21 miles over water and would be the first time in history that a man would travel internationally from one country to another in the air. After spending the morning loading up their supplies and launching a small test balloon to confirm the winds were with them, Blanchard and Jeffries boarded their basket and launched their balloon towards France. At first, things seemed to be going as planned. They had prepared ballasts which helped to stabilize their basket that would also serve as weights that could be thrown overboard whenever the balloon began to lose altitude. Throughout the first half of the flight, the men periodically threw out a ballast to get some lift back into the air anytime the balloon seemed to dip a little too much. Just under 2 hours into their flight, the men spotted the French coast in the distance, and they began celebrating. They were about to do something no one had done before. But the excitement quickly turned to concern when they realized that their balloon was again starting to lose altitude and they had thrown their last available ballast overboard 30 minutes ago. Still miles from the French coast and the raging English Channel growing ever closer beneath them, Blanchard and Jeffries began desperately throwing things out of their balloon. First, the silk oars they had packed that they thought they could use to paddle the air with. Next, their scientific instruments and food. Anything that was not essential was thrown overboard, but nothing seemed to help as the balloon kept falling closer and closer to the water. The men, now in a full-blown panic, began to strip and threw their clothing into the water as a desperate attempt to lose any and all possible weight. When all seemed doomed, the balloon caught a gust of warm air that lifted the now nearly naked men back up into the air just long enough to make it over to the coast of France. The euphoria of escaping death by drowning in the English Channel was quickly met with the realization that they might instead die on the French coast as the men now found themselves losing altitude over a thick forest. A crash into one of the trees would throw them out of the basket and into a free fall towards the ground a few hundred feet below.
These guys, this can't win, mate. You get past one unlitty, you have to meet another unlitty. See, this is why I say in life, never try. Because if you try, you might end up dying, So never try. I'm kidding, guys. Always try. I'm just kidding.
Left with nothing else to get rid of, the 2 men realized they hadn't peed all day. The men began peeing into 2 external bladders, which they quickly threw overboard. In Jeffries' reports of the flight, he writes that between the 2 of them, they were able to let loose about 5 pounds of urine, which ultimately saved their lives. The balloon stayed in the air just long enough to not crash into the trees, and as a clearing opened up ahead, the men began to grab nearby branches to slow themselves down and made a safe landing in the clearing. The men were soon greeted by supporters who came to bring them back to the public to celebrate their record-breaking accomplishment of being the first men to fly over the English Channel. Upon seeing the 2 men in their underwear, the supporters quickly gave Blanchard and Jeffries their jackets to cover up before escorting them back. I guess lucky for them, cameras weren't invented yet. Number 4, the first traffic light. It's the mid-1800s and London has a huge problem with horse-drawn carriages. Namely, they keep killing people. In 1866, 1,102 people died and 1,334 were injured in horse or carriage accidents on the streets of London. To put this in perspective, Los Angeles had 364 traffic fatalities in 2023. So basically, you were 3 times more likely to die in a traffic accident in 1860s London than modern-day LA. Needless to say, this was a huge problem, and a man named John Peake Knight stepped up to solve it. Knight worked as a railway manager, and he came up with the idea to bring the railway signaling system to London's streets. His design used a similar semaphore flag system during the day and a gas-powered light that changed from green to red at night. The entire traffic light would be operated manually by a
made by a black man, by the way. You search it up.
Police officer who stood underneath the signal. The design was finalized and soon installed in Parliament Square in London on December 9, 1868. Knight's invention was initially met with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. At first, Londoners saw the strange new contraption with its red and green signals and wondered what on earth is going on. Drivers argued with each other. Horses unsurprisingly didn't know what the lights meant and just kept moving along. One horse was even reported to nibble on the semaphore arm, probably thinking it was a new kind of snack. Despite the initial confusion and a few bumps, Londoners slowly began to appreciate the logic behind Knight's invention, and things were good. For about a month. See, in January of the following year, just 1 month later, gas from the lamp leaked, causing an explosion that poured burning hot gas on the police officer operating the traffic light, killing him on the spot. As you can expect, Parliament wasn't thrilled seeing people turned into human torches in the middle of their square. So the traffic light was removed, and London would not see another traffic light until 1929, when electric lights were installed. Number 3, the first parachute jump. Okay, we're back in the...
They're good, yeah, but history just isn't ready for it, you know. There was definitely guys in history, they had a cool idea that would later go on to be adopted. By that time, the world is just not ready for it yet. So, you know, calm down and let your future descendant handle that one, you know.
Late 1790s in France, and as we learned in the first story, the hot air balloon craze is soaring and people are flying higher than ever. A man named André Jacques Garneron, a balloonist from Paris, seeking his own place in history, is hard at work developing what would become the world's first parachute. The thing with Garneron is he wasn't just designing these things, he was also the test pilot. He would hold public demonstrations of his new devices that would make him somewhat of a controversial figure. On one occasion, he took a woman up with him in a balloon, which upset many officials. The police protested the event, saying that a woman's delicate organs could not handle the high altitudes and that he might kill her. He did it and
that's quite goofy. So they don't do science. You don't know what is going on. You're making all these claims. Women's organs can't handle the air. That's quite stupid, you know?
Anyway, and unsurprisingly, the woman was fine. But perhaps the biggest contribution Garneron made towards aeronautics was his first successful parachute jump. On October 22, 1797, in Monceau Park, Garneron stood in a basket attached to his silk parachute that was connected to a hot air balloon. He slowly floated up and watched Paris shrink below him as he ascended to the dizzying height of 3,000 feet. It was then Garneron cut the rope attaching his parachute to the balloon and began his descent. The parachute unfurled with a grand flourish, and for a brief moment, it seemed like everything was going according to plan. He proudly waved his French flag from high in the sky so all could see, and then the winds started to pick up. Now remember, Garneron was not harnessed into a modern-day parachute. He was sitting unsecured in a basket 3,000 feet in the air attached to what was basically a frameless silk umbrella. The winds started spinning the basket in a circle, gently at first, then increasingly more and more violently as he descended. At points during his descent, the basket was nearly parallel with the ground. Garneron became violently ill and began vomiting all over himself as he spun around and around. When he finally touched the ground, the velocity of the fall bounced the basket back into the air for a second bonus ride. Eventually, he finally landed about 1 kilometer from the park where he was found uninjured, though probably dizzy and smelling like vomit. His supporters picked him up and rushed him back to the park where he was greeted by a cheering crowd. Now that I think about it, this might also be the first documented case of air sickness, too. Number 2.
This guy, he was crazy, I can't lie. Like, me personally, I would never do something like this. I don't really like heights as well, but imagine being one of the first people to go up in the air. That takes a lot of balls because you never know what could happen. So, and even me, when the airplane started to become commercial, bloods were flying up and down. If I was alive at that time, I would have waited a hot sec to make sure it's safe before getting on. I'm not going to be the guinea pig to be on the BBC News, mate. Not me, no sorry.
First submarine attack. For our next story, we're going back a few years to 1776, and the American Revolutionary War is in full swing. The British Navy is the most powerful fleet in the world, and the HMS Eagle is holding a tight blockade over New York Harbor. The Americans, massively outgunned, came up with an invention which they called the turtle that ended up being used in what is now known as the first documented submarine attack in history. That didn't actually work, but it's still a cool story, so let me show you. The idea of American inventor David Bushnell, the turtle was a tiny man-powered egg-shaped submarine made completely of oak. A single pilot would sit upright in the egg and use foot pedals to operate a tiny propeller.
Did Dr. Eggman cook this one?
That would move the turtle forward underwater. Imagine riding a stationary bike in a small barrel, underwater in complete darkness, while quickly running out of air to breathe. That's basically what it was like trying to pilot this thing. But needless to say, the Americans were desperate to try anything to break this blockade. On the night of September 7, 1776, Sergeant Ezra Lee climbed into the turtle. His mission was to pilot it undetected to the HMS Eagle and attach an explosive charge to the bottom of the ship. The bomb was mounted onto the turtle and attached to a drill head that Lee would manually drill into the ship's wooden hull. In the cover of darkness, Sergeant Lee began pedaling his way underwater towards the HMS Eagle. He reached the ship undetected, and then using a hand pump to fill the bottom of the submarine with water, he dived in the turtle to a spot under the ship. Once in position and with just 30 minutes of air, Sergeant Lee began to crank the drill to attach the explosives. As he begins drilling, Sergeant Lee becomes frustrated. The drill doesn't seem to be going into the ship as it should. It turns out the hull of the HMS Eagle had been upgraded with copper plating to protect its wooden hull from damage, and as hard as Lee tried the drill, he could not pierce this protective metal layer. Running out of oxygen, he eventually gave up and set and released the charge in the water and pedaled away as quickly as he could with his oxygen nearly running out. There are some reports British Marines saw him and began chasing him in a rowboat, but he was able to escape unharmed. Upon returning safely from his failed mission, Sergeant Lee was commended by General George Washington for his bravery, and he was made part of his Secret Service. Number 1. First blood transfusion. Okay, this one is wild, as it involves transferring blood from an animal into a human. It's the mid-17th century, and humans are still kind of figuring out how the human body works. Best medical practices at the time were done at your local barber surgeon, and often involved bleeding you with leeches. In comes Jean-Baptiste Denis, a French physician set on making his mark on the medical world. Now, the thing about Denis that you should know is he came from a less prestigious university, so he was mocked and outcasted by the medical elite in Paris. This created an intense urge to prove he was just as good as the wealthy physicians who were born with everything. The cutting-edge medical research of the era was focused on the possibility of blood transfusions as a potential cure for diseases, and in 1667, a heated rivalry between Britain and France to see which country could successfully perform the first human blood transfusion began. The British had successfully taken blood from one dog and put it into another, which initially put them ahead in the race, as French doctors struggled to recreate the results. Denis began conducting experiments with a barber surgeon named Paul Emerez, and the two were successful at transferring 9 ounces of blood between 2 small dogs. Though one dog became very weak and the other seemed fine, but it was, quote, not awake and gay like it was earlier. Honestly, both of those dogs probably got messed up pretty bad by Denis's experiment, but because they didn't die, the 2 men continued to push forward and found success with 19 more blood transfusions performed on dogs with none of them dying. Denis was hell-bent on showing up both the British and the doctors in Paris who mocked him, and quickly began conducting blood transfusions with other animals, such as sheep, cows, horses, and goats, all in the pursuit of being the first to perform the procedure he believed would make him famous, the first human blood transfusion. Denis decided that when the time came, he would use the blood of a lamb, the symbol of the blood of Christ, for the procedure. I guess now would be a good time to remind you that blood types were not discovered until 1901, so these guys didn't have the best understanding of what blood was or what it was for. On June 15, 1667, Denis and Emerez were finally given the opportunity to conduct their groundbreaking experimental procedure. A 15-year-old boy who had been suffering from intense fevers for 2 months would be the test subject. The boy had been leeched by barber surgeons over 20 times with no results. The experimental blood transfusion was a last-ditch attempt to save his life. The 2 men transfused 12 ounces of lamb's blood into the boy's veins, and allegedly by the next morning, the boy was completely cured. Denis then attempted another blood transfusion with a middle-aged barber, this time with sheep's blood, who again did not die from the procedure, and he felt he had punched his ticket to the big leagues. In reality, the success of the 2 animal-to-human blood transfusions were most likely due to the fact that the small amounts of blood that was used did not trigger a lethal allergic reaction. Because as we find out, Denise's next patients were not as lucky. A Swedish nobleman who fell ill traveling in Paris died during his second infusion of calf's blood under Denise's care. And a fourth patient named Antoine Moroy had even worse luck. His only real ailment was he was prone to running away from his wife to enjoy the Paris nightlife, and his wife did not appreciate that. He was infused with calf's blood, which made him violently ill, and on the second infusion he suffered an extreme allergic reaction that nearly killed him. After making a miraculous recovery, Moroy's wife urged Denise to do another transfusion, which he had first refused, but later relented and performed. Moroy died the following night, and Denise was charged with manslaughter. In the court proceedings, it was discovered that Moroy's actual cause of death was arsenic poisoning from his wife. This cleared Denise's name legally, but his reputation as a doctor was practically destroyed, and the practice of blood transfusions was banned in France until the mid-19th century, barring explicit approval from the Paris Faculty of Medicine, the guys who Denise hated.
Yeah, that's probably for the best, man. Those blood transfusions, they did not know what they were doing. Golly. Well, that's the first. You be the first to subscribe.